As we work to establish a personal code of ethics, it can be really useful to take a look at some of the established frameworks for ethical thought that have been created over the years. By doing this, we can peel back some of the layers of our thinking to get at what's behind our justifications for what we think is right and wrong. And ultimately, we can sort of suss out these gray areas and tough questions to figure out how do we make a decision about what is right and wrong. And remember, this is all in service of trying to be able to plan ahead and identify our own biases so that we can create guidelines for ourselves that will help us to encounter tough situations prepared. So we're going to start by taking a look at perhaps one of the first ways you start to think about right and wrong, which is simply by looking at consequences. And there's a whole branch of thought that tries to figure out what is ethically right and wrong by just taking the cause and the effect. And if the effect is good, then the cause must be good. And if the effect is bad, then the cause must be bad. And this is essentially called consequentialism. The first and most obvious branch of consequentialism is known as egoism. And that's basically, if it's right for me, then it's right for everybody else. If everybody else were to follow this, it will check and balance and everything will be good. I watch my back, you watch your back, we'll all be taken care of, and everybody will be just fine. Now, this obviously breaks down pretty quickly. You'll see with all of the models that we discuss, they all have great benefits in some situations and great flaws and shortcomings in others. None of these work 100% of the time. And so the trick is to figure out when to use the right model and to know why you're using it and what could go wrong with that line of thinking. So obviously egoism works great if everybody is well-intentioned. However, this doesn't protect us from each other if there's a conflict of interest. If what is right for me involves hurting you, and what's right for you involves hurting me, now suddenly we have a dubious ethical situation where we are now not safe and we are hurting each other. Does that make it right? Well, the opposite is the knee-jerk reaction. If I am going to hurt someone by looking out for myself, then I'll look out for others. This is altruism. What's right for others is right. If you watch everyone else's back, in turn, someone else will be watching your back and we'll all be taken care of. Now, this starts to break down really quickly in our sort of individualized, independence-based society. This seems to paint a much more rosy-colored, more optimistic view of the world, but all it takes is one bad apple to ruin the whole batch. This relies on unanimous buy-in. And so it often works well in small closed systems, small communities where everybody can work towards each other's good, but falls apart quickly in large, unruly situations. It's sort of the way that communism works in theory, but in practice becomes extremely problematic. Now, another possible shortcoming here is that sometimes you need to be a little egoist in order to be altruistic. For example, if you take care of, say, your ailing mother so much that it is to the neglect of your own health, you may end up getting sick. And then if you're sick, you can't end up helping your mother either. And so neither of you end up being taken care of. When your altruism depends on your own health, and your health is not being cared for by someone else, this falls apart very quickly. So there needs to be some blend of the two, where there's a balance of what's good for me and what's good for others. So Jeremy Bentham introduces what's called utilitarianism, and this works on the principle of trying to maximize happiness and minimize pain, to do the most good to the most amount of people, yourself included. How do you calculate this? Well, this is where we use what's known as cost-benefit analysis, or risk-benefit analysis. You make a pro and con list, and you try and figure out what are the costs and what are the benefits to my decision. And if the pros outweigh the cons, then it's an ethical decision. The trick is this doesn't work out so well in no-win situations. Here's a sort of famous example. In 1968, Ford unveiled the Ford Pinto, and this was a much sought after new model of car, and so to meet demand and try and corner the market, they accelerated their schedule to the point where there were perhaps some design flaws in the building of the Ford Pinto. And in 1972, Lily Gray and Richard Grimshaw were driving a Ford Pinto about 30 miles an hour and got into a small collision, at which point the engine exploded and killed Lily Gray and severely injured Richard Grimshaw. The family sued Ford, and Ford ultimately ended up paying out a total of roughly $3 million in compensatory damages, $3.5 million in punitive damages. Kind of an embarrassing moment for Ford, but they were able to put it behind them until it happened again. Another collision around 30 miles an hour, another explosion of the engine, more deaths. And then it happened again, and again, and it turned out that these engines were very prone to exploding upon 30-mile-per-hour impact. So, Ford decided to do some cost-benefit analysis, and they decided we have two options. We can either redesign the engine and make all the necessary changes to make them safer, and that will have the benefit of saving the amount of money that we would have to put towards paying out all of these legal fees when we get sued, and it'll save all of these people. However, it will have the con of having to pay what it costs to fix these vehicles. And so in their cost-benefit analysis, they found that they calculated it would cost around $11 per vehicle, and they calculated this out for all of the vehicles that they had on the road, and it would cost them roughly $137 million in order to fix these engines. Now, on the flip side, they calculated that there would be roughly 180 deaths and 180 burns in a year's time that were due to these engines, and paying out all of that would ultimately cost about $49.5 million. So they said the societal cost would be they would have to pay $137 million to fix this problem, versus the benefit of saving $49.5 million worth of deaths and injuries. And you can clearly see how this plays out. $137 million is a lot more than $49.5 million, so they deemed it in their best interest and in society's best interest to not change anything. And they would just let 180 people die and 180 people burn in order to not spend the $137 million. This is clearly problematic. This is the same sort of cost-benefit analysis that leads to inaction when there's a grievance by maybe a small minority of people. For example, the argument against using Native American mascots in sports. This could potentially deeply offend Native Americans, but it is a beneficial marketing scheme, historically, for a team that uses it, and this gives pleasure to millions of people. Now, if we consider that Native Americans are roughly 1% of the population, by cost-benefit analysis, by utilitarianism, we would have no choice but to say, these Native Americans are just going to have to suck it up, because look at the amount of benefit that it is giving to all of the other millions of people. Clearly, quickly problematic logic. Can cash buy anything? What is the price of a life? How do you figure out the price of these intangible outcomes? How much does offending someone cost? How much does pleasure cost? How do you decide if you want to use your funds to build a stadium for a sporting event, or to use those funds to build a hospital in that same location? How do you measure the amount of pleasure a stadium would bring to weigh against the amount of pain a hospital will save people from? What if the person in question is a masochist and enjoys pain? How do you maximize happiness and minimize pain when the borderline between pain and pleasure are non-existent or blurred at best? All of these things make consequentialism really tricky, because consequences are often hard to quantify and hard to suss out. And so sometimes we have to turn towards flat out right and wrong. For example, is lying right or wrong? Consequentially, you could look at it situationally. Maybe lying is right if it saves someone. Maybe if it saves a certain number of people, it is justifiable. Torture. Is torture right or wrong? Well, most of us might agree that torture is flat out wrong. Obviously, this is clearly debatable, but just for the sake of argument, if we agree that torture is flat out wrong, is it justifiable if by torturing someone you save one person? You would probably say, if you thought that it was wrong, that it is still wrong. But what if by torturing someone you save 1,000 people, or 100,000 people, or the entire world by torturing one person? Where is the line at which this breaks down? So sometimes we have to say consequentialism is just too fraught with relativity and we can't figure it out, so let's just make it cut and dry. Yes, it is right, or no, it is wrong. Non-consequentialism. And so the first time that we are often introduced to non-consequentialist thinking is when we look at religion or nature. And this is divine command or natural law. And this is basically, if you're a theist, you call it divine command, and if you're more of a humanist, you call it natural law. But this is the idea that certain things are flat out right or wrong because of the way that God or nature set them up. Now this has obvious shortcomings as well, because how do you know whose interpretation of divine command or natural law is correct? Obviously, people have been trying to figure out what God is commanding for thousands and thousands of years, and we have a plethora of different religious views on any given ethical issue. We have not been able to reach consensus on what God says. So how do you reach consensus on what non-consequentialist decision is ethically right or wrong? So John Locke decides, okay, we have to introduce some sort of barometer. So we'll take, maybe we can't figure out who is right and who is wrong, but we can figure out the majority of who is right. And we'll take majority rule. So if most people think this is right, if most people think this is what God is saying, if most people think this is the way nature is meant to work, then that will be what we go with. Now this has a lot of problems too, because the majority is not always ethically right. If this were the case, if we always went with majority rule, oppression would never end. There would be no justice for an underdog because underdogs are, by definition, in the minority. They are, by definition, the one you would not be listening to in majority rule. You'd have to throw out the entire civil rights movement. So sometimes you need more than just a majority rule. You need to look at where this is all going and what the end point is. So Aristotle has the teleological argument, which looks at the telos, the purpose of a given item in question. And it tries to figure out what course of action would best work towards fulfilling the purpose of that item in question. For example, a flute. What is the purpose of a flute? A flute is meant to be played, it's meant to create beautiful music, it's meant to bring enjoyment to an audience, pleasure to the person playing it. And so if you're trying to decide, who do I give this one flute to? Do I give it to the man who is a flautist and knows how to play it well, or do I give it to the man who is only going to make awful, awful sounds with it and we're going to want to plug our ears? The ethical decision here, according to the teleological argument, would be to give it to the person who can best fulfill the purpose of the flute, to play it well. The problem here is, how do you know what people deserve? This is essentially setting up a meritocracy. The person who has earned the right to best perform the purpose of a thing gets the thing. But what if there are inequalities baked into the system that allow someone to have more access to building up that merit than someone else? For example, what if there is a perfectly well-qualified, run-of-the-mill flute player who knows how to play the flute adequately well, and the other person, who would probably make awful, awful music with it, is actually a prodigy who was just never able to afford a way to practice. They were born into a situation where, because of finances, they were never given the opportunity to realize their potential, and so therefore, their overwhelming, prodigious talent was never realized. And so they would be the one to actually deserve this flute, this amazing, prodigious flautist would certainly be the one you'd want to give the flute to, but you would have no way of knowing that because that person was born into a system that was given unequal access. So how do you decide what something's purpose is, and how do you decide what someone deserves? This gets really, really confusing when you use something vaguer than a flute, like people, or laws, or rights and freedoms, and all of these things, justice issues. How do you figure out what purposes and deserts are? So, we could ask about, well, maybe looking at purpose is the wrong argument. Maybe we can't figure out that far down the road, but we can look at right now. And right now, we should be concerned about people's unalienable rights. Something is ethical if it does not impinge upon any individual rights. And this is the libertarian argument. Now, there's I suppose, a distinction between libertarianism as a philosophy and libertarianism as a political party, though there are certainly shared underlying principles. But libertarianism as a philosophy is all about freedom of choice. It's all about trying to avoid impinging on individual rights. Even the right to make bad choices. Even the right to harm oneself. So essentially, it's whatever makes you happy. As long as you are pursuing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and we don't impinge upon that, then it is an ethical and acceptable decision. There's some clear pitfalls with this as well. All it takes is one crazy person to mess this all up. You also have to ask, where do these rights come from? And are these rights really the most important thing? Is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness really the most important goal? Are there times when it's actually ethically important to impinge upon individual rights? To stop someone from making a free choice? There's the idea of freedom to, the freedom to do something, but there's also the idea of freedom from, being saved from something. And so we see this play out all the time, where there's a tension between the freedom to make choices and the freedom from others who would make bad choices. So, my freedom to own a gun versus my freedom from being shot. How do we balance these freedoms to and freedom from? How do we figure out what actually is the most beneficial and ethical situation when there is a conflict and a tension between outcomes? So, Immanuel Kant takes this and shifts it a little bit. He qualifies it a little bit with what he calls the categorical imperative. And he says, okay, yes, the goal is indeed freedom. We should be trying to promote freedom with our ethics. But not happiness. It's not about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Freedom does not mean doing whatever you want, and our unalienable rights come not from nature, not from divine command or natural law, but from reason and intuition. We figured these things out, and so we should be using reason and intuition to try and figure out what rights should be upheld. And so his argument comes down to intentions. And he has 3 checks to try and figure out if something is ethical. If your decision is respecting others, it is ethical. This is his first check. Does it respect others? The second is, can my ethical maxim be applied universally to all people? In other words, is there a double standard? If I say this is ethically correct, if someone else were in my shoes, could they say the same thing? And third, is my decision unconstrained and autonomous? We don't want to be making decisions because we're forced into them, because someone's holding a gun to our head. We can't make ethical decisions if we are coerced. However, is there such a thing as an autonomous action? Can anything truly be uncoerced and uncontingent? Can any maxim actually be universally applied? These get really, really complicated when you start to realize that everybody is constrained by something, subtly or otherwise. You may not have a gun held to your head, but you have certain debts to society, certain indebtedness to somebody, you have certain influences which are pushing you and steering you one way or another. We are all beholden to somebody because of the tangled practice of society. So, John Rawls looks at these entanglements. He looks at these contracts that we enter into by all of these situations in which we are beholden to people. This is the fair contract theory, where he says, basically, you are making an ethical decision if it's a situation that is not necessarily unconstrained or autonomous, but if it's a situation that you agreed to and that no one had unfair bargaining power when you entered into this agreement. So, Kant describes this as duty. You have certain duties based on the situations you enter into. Membership obligations, so to speak. For example, you owe it to your country to defend it because you are a member of its people. This is part of the obligation of membership. The country lets you live here, so therefore you are obligated, you have a duty to protect that country should someone try to attack it. The question is, first of all, is there ever actually fair bargaining power? How do you quantify who's on a level playing field? What if no agreement can actually be reached? What if there's a stalemate? How do you have a contract entered into freely and without unfair bargaining power if you can't actually agree upon a contract? What if the contracts are unspoken? We have hundreds of societal contracts that we never put down in writing, so how do you know which ones you are a part of at any given time? Often this leads to conflicts of interest. You are a member of many, many, many contracts all at once. So what's more important? Your contract, your obligation, your duty to your country that lets you live there, or your contract and obligation, your duty to being a member of the human race? If your country goes to war, you have a duty to the country to perhaps kill the person trying to destroy your country. On the other hand, you have perhaps a duty to not kill the members of your own human race. Which is more important? Which contract do you uphold in that moment? This is what the journalist Kevin Carter was facing when he had to figure out what's more important, his contract with the victim being stalked by that vulture as just a member of a fellow human and the member of human race, or his contract with the reader as a journalist and to be unbiased and objective. Now, all of these models for thought, consequentialist, non-consequentialist, fall along a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum is deontology. This is essentially that there is a moral absolute that is applicable across all situations. It's just a matter of finding it, and that's the hard part. On the other side is moral relativism, where there are no absolutes, and morals are totally dependent on each situation, and each person has their own totally independent and fully acceptable moral system, whatever it may be. It's just a matter of figuring out how they all play together. Now, somewhere in the middle is a relatively newer version of what's called care-based or relational ethics. And a care-based model of ethics came out of second-wave feminism, where they tried to figure out that we are all relationally interconnected. It's a picture of interdependence. It's not moral relativism where anything goes and everything is situational, but it's also not deontology where everything is rigid and handed down by God or nature. It's not unmoored from principle, but it's also not blind to situation. It tries to say that context matters, and we are all relationally interconnected, and we all need each other. We are dependent on each other, and we have to find a balance between emotion and reason in order to find an acceptable situation to any case on a case-by-case basis. This tries to assume, as its main tenet, that the two sides of the story are not adversarial. The two parties are not in an adversarial relationship by nature. And this is coming in response. First wave feminism gets a lot of criticism by the fact that it could be accused as women being man haters. And so there's an adversarial relationship being established between men and women. And so second wave feminism attempts to sort of add more nuance to the fold here, to say, no, it's not men versus women, it's not right versus wrong, it's about an interdependent and interconnected relationship where there has to be a mutually beneficial outcome where we find a balance. It's about all of us needing each other in a non-adversarial way, where there is complicated context, and there is principle, and it all has to play together. Now, this is still without a lot of legal precedent, and there are a lot fewer case studies of this mode of ethical thinking being explicitly used, so it's hard to see how this is exactly evolving. But it's what's behind a lot of postmodern theory and relational theory, and it's probably where there's the most fruit, where there's a balance between all of these and a situational usage between all of these different models that we see. Now, ultimately, we have to come up with a model that works for us, a personal code of ethics. So the Society of Professional Journalists have taken all of this into consideration, and they've decided on a code of ethics for journalists. And this is what it looks like. Number 1, seek truth and report it by being honest, fair, and courageous. Truth is the most important thing here. Honesty, fairness, courageous. This is where we get the whole idea of journalistic integrity and objectivity and being unbiased and all of this. Number 2, minimize harm to sources, subjects, and colleagues. Don't screw anyone over. Don't throw anyone under the bus. Try and not harm the subjects that you're dealing with. Number 3, act independently, remembering your first obligation is to the public and its right to know. This is the attempt to avoid bias, to avoid being in the pocket of some corporate entity or private party, trying to remember that no matter what, we are truth seekers and the public has the right to the truth. And number 4, to be accountable to readers, viewers, listeners, and other journalists. You are not above any of them, and you should be held accountable for what you produce. Now, Matthew LaPlante is a journalist who is one of the case studies in your book, in the Philax Convergent Journalism book. It's on page 225 if you want to follow along. But he decides to take this on and figure out how to make this personally nuanced for himself, because he and his the photojournalist he was traveling with found themselves in a very strange situation, a really ethically fraught situation, when they traveled to Ethiopia in 2011 in order to report on tribal infanticide. Essentially what's going on here was that children in this Ethiopian tribe were being determined to have what was called the Mingi curse, in which they were considered demon-possessed and they would be killed, left in the bush, suffocated with dirt, abandoned. And some of the markers for this curse would be what most of us would deem as seemingly arbitrary. For example, they would be deemed to have the curse if their top teeth came in before their bottom teeth. So they described their situation thus, quote, "We had many ethical challenges," LaPlante said. "How do you put this in a cultural context without validating it, but without vilifying it? How do you explain the media to people who have never seen a newspaper, television, or internet, so that they can make an intelligent decision on whether to speak to us?" The journalists also faced a horrifying ethical issue. What would they do if a child were sacrificed when they were present? "We ultimately decided we were there as journalists, as observers. If that meant we were going to stand by and watch a child killed, that was our job and we would fulfill it," LaPlante said. "We also decided that if either of us couldn't do that, that neither of us would hold the other responsible because our humanity came before the dedication to journalism. So they decided they were going to adopt this journalistic code of ethics, but they were going to add to it perhaps one of Rawls' social contracts, one of Rawls' fair contract principles, that their contract to humanity came first, before their contract as a journalist. This is what you have to do as an individual in journalism or just in life, in whatever field you pursue. Figure out what you're going to do in any situation based on a personal code of ethics. Hopefully this has given you a framework, a smattering of frameworks by which you're able to step outside of yourself a bit and figure out what's behind our gut decisions, what's behind our thoughts of what's right and wrong, and how do we come to those decisions. When we're put into a situation where cost-benefit analysis seems to lead nowhere, or seems to lead to something that still feels wrong in our gut, how do we step outside of that and find a different model? When we start to realize that there are conflicts of interests in our conflicting contracts, how do we use a different model to figure out what might be right and what might be wrong? And ultimately, how do we enter into a relationally interconnected society in an ethically responsible way? So that is a task that I can't answer for you, but hopefully now you are a bit more equipped to be able to answer it for yourself and walk into the future a little bit more prepared for these ethically tricky gray areas.